The Lost American, Unrestricted Warfare, the Persian Gulf War. What have we learned? I remember the day that my mom returned from the Persian Gulf War. She'd been a Navy nurse who'd been activated and served 6 months in the Persian Gulf. I was so happy to have her back. I felt as if the U.S. military was invincible. We seemed to have crushed our opponent. This led to the next couple of years, up to 9/11, feeling as if the U.S. was truly the hegemon on the planet. Yet, in Unrestricted Warfare, the authors argue that the U.S. really wasted this time. The end of the Cold War and the Persian Gulf War coming right after it made the U.S. the leading hegemon. Inside the military, though, were those who thought the U.S. military needed to be reformed. The biggest issue is that a lot of the military leaders thought that Congress would slash their budgets. Another big issue was Moore's Law and the development cycle of new weapons with the military. You could have a nice idea, but it would take years for it to actually become reality. Meanwhile, the technology it was originally based on would be obsolete by the time the weapon was ready. Despite this, some branches of the military did reform themselves. The U.S. Air Force became more expeditionary. The U.S. Navy decided that it would focus on support of coastal and land-based combat as opposed to fighting naval battles at sea. There was one big idea that seemed to frame everything that the U.S. military, the U.S. government, and most importantly, the U.S. public wanted. That was to have zero casualties. The U.S. wanted to win, but to have none of its military personnel die in obtaining that victory. The American military, with all of its military might, appeared stagnant in its tactics. This is what I felt was one of the main arguments coming from the fourth chapter in Unrestricted Warfare, and this is where I think there needs to be some clarification as to what the authors may mean. The idea that the U.S. military is stagnant has to deal with the fact that the U.S. relies on technology and high-tech weapons to win battles. It's believed that as we pump more money into R&D research, weapons development, etc., that will stay ahead in technology and win wars. This is not the case. All one has to do is to look at how Afghanistan and Iraq turned out. In Iraq, it was the surge, pouring troops that used counterinsurgency doctrine into and around Baghdad that helped to turn the tide in around the 2007-2008 timeframe. If one looks at the insurgency starting in Iraq, then it was not waged with high-tech weapons. Insurgents mainly used the IED to inflict casualties on the U.S. One could even argue that as the insurgency went on in Iraq, there was less ambushes because insurgents realized that there was no point in taking on a U.S. convoy or other U.S. military units. They'd most likely lose the battle. They changed tactics because the battlefield demanded it. In August of 2021, the U.S. military pulled out of Afghanistan, ending 20 years of war in that country. The U.S. had the technology and the weapons, but still had difficulty putting down the Taliban insurgency that really started to gain momentum and rebuild itself between 2005 and 2010. I know that the U.S. could easily have defeated the Taliban on the battlefield at the tactical level. The U.S. main issue, in my opinion, was that the strategy that was used in Afghanistan was not working. Yes, counterinsurgency was attempted, but Afghanistan is also a country where implementing a counterinsurgency strategy is very difficult. I bring all this up because it makes you wonder, how much has the U.S. military changed since the Gulf War? We learned a lot in Iraq and Afghanistan, but as the authors in the chapter, they ask the question, why has there not been a revolution in military affairs?